It's so wonderful to see all of you. I
Good
just wanted to make
morning.
sure I got on. I'm gonna step
Mhm.
away real quick because I just jumped off a call. I'm gonna run to the restroom. I'll be back.
Gotcha. I think we should have
Gotcha.
just said,
Yeah.
pajamas optional for this one. So we didn't have to put on any makeup or anything.
Do you know, almost since I started StoryMuse, I've been having this dream of creating this thing that I'm calling Board for a Day, where I would convene a group of advisors. And this was back when we lived in the real world, of course. And they would come over to my house wearing their pajamas, and I would fix them French toast and coffee, and they would just, help me do visioning and all of that. And then at the end of the day, they would vote to disband themselves. So no further, responsibility to StoryMuse. Just that's why I call it Board for a Day. I think it's such a fun and lovely idea, and I keep hoping that we'll get back to it one day.
I think that's wonderful. I would even
Mhm.
plan a trip to Atlanta for that.
Ooh, nice. I thought you were going to say
Kathleen, we could plan one of our
Day.
trips.
Yes.
Kathleen and I go on trips, and we could plan a trip to Atlanta for Board
really?
for a Day.
I'm down for that.
Fabulous.
Hi, Catherine. It's early in your neck of the woods, too.
Oh, that's why I've got my coffee. So, good. Beautiful sunrise.
Nice. Well, it's on its way to you, Kathleen, from Montana to Portland. And us on the East Coast, we have no excuse.
I'm blowing some sunshine your way.
Nice.
We're welcoming the rain here. We are thankful for the rain. So putting out all the fires. So
Yeah.
This is the first clear day we've had in a while, so that's kind of nice.
mm-hmm.
Yeah. How are things going out there with all of that?
Well, there's rain moving through now, so there's a lot of fires burning that are not nearly contained, like less than 20% contained. So this should be a good cycle right now.
Wow.
Yeah, it's hard to remember what day it is and what's still going on and what hasn't gone on and what has happened. It's almost like for me, I'm definitely in more of a response mode when someone I know is going through something or something's happening in a place, and then I find out, are they okay? Is that person I know okay? And that's sometimes all the bandwidth I have, for to stay connected to the people I know and try to vicariously experience and then send love and support and then kind of get ready for the next thing.
Yeah. So these are such crazy times. It's really hard to know how to respond to anything right now, right? Because there's just so much to pay attention to.
I know with Ruth Bader Ginsburg's passing, I don't know about you guys, but Friday I was just in the dumps, and it's kind of been like that all weekend. So I don't know if you guys have been feeling crummy about that. So
yeah, well, we're having Alternate Roots, which is how a number of us know each other, is having its virtual gathering as alternative to when we would normally be together in physical space. And a number of us were on a call when the news came out on Friday, and I was so grateful to have been in community with people as we were able to just really cry and breathe and hold space with each other. And gosh, I definitely would have known the impact of that event, but to see it just viscerally ripple across different people's bodies and the awareness, it was just an incredibly powerful moment.
I'm gonna jump in again. For me, it was our pre-Rosh Hashanah meal, the Jewish New Year, And so we were with family, and so it was kind of a totally different experience than it usually is for us on that night. And I'll add that the day before, the Constitution Center in Philadelphia had awarded her their Freedom Medal, and I was virtually part of that ceremony, and they did it all as a video. And even at the end, where I expected that maybe she would be shown from her home to accept the award, they did it by way of a letter, and a letter that she had written. And so we had the feeling that something was imminent, because I couldn't imagine that she wouldn't have personally been accepting the award.
Mm-hmm. All right. I'm thankful for people continuing to find ways to support each other and find meaning and share that meaning, because it's really, I don't know, I think moments like this where we can have a focus on something like story, I think that's it's 1 hour that we're doing a workshop on storytelling, but what we're doing is we're really reinforcing a culture of like valuing people and valuing what they do and valuing diversity of experiences. So that's just, I'm glad you're all here. I'm glad we can do this together. All right, I'm gonna turn it over. Hi, Tina. I'm going to turn it on over to Shannon to get us into our number 3 workshop. So I can't believe we've already come to the last of our series, Shannon.
I know, and good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to be here for this opportunity. I do believe that story is a kind of medicine, and medicine, the real good healing medicine, the old time medicine, is what we need right now. So let's begin. So we have been talking a lot about how we construct our stories, the transformative power of our stories, and starting with our own personal stories. And now we're going to look at how we build out from there. When I was growing up, the child of a minister, we would often be invited to go out to eat with the families in our church. And when we were at this one church for a very long time, we fell into this pattern of going out to eat with this one family periodically. And my sister and I would have this decision point of, would we go to one pull up a trough restaurant or the other, Bonanza or Piccadilly? One of us had a favorite and the other had the favorite, and we would always have to, decide between us. I can't even remember now which one had the other, favorite. Was it me with the Bonanza or with the Piccadilly? I just know that it was a really big deal for us for a few years of our lives. One day when we were in line at the Bonanza, and I don't know if you all know how these restaurants work, but inevitably on a Sunday afternoon after church, you have to stand in an interminably long line as everyone has gotten out of church at the same time. And there was always this joke about the Methodists have to beat the Baptists to the restaurant. And so you would stand there and your stomach would be growling so much as you would be waiting, and you have to wrap around the line, watching the other people going with their trays down, just like piling up with all this food, and thinking about what you were going to get. Were you going to get a whole bunch of corn? Were you going to get the roast beef that day? Sorry if I'm offending my vegetarian friends' ears. So on this one day in particular, just as we were about to start with our cafeteria trays, I happened to hear the door open, which wouldn't, as it has opened, you know, many times behind me, would not normally have caught my attention, but I just happened to look back and I saw this man come into the restaurant who felt like he was stepping into our world from a completely different planet. He was giant and he was filthy dirty, and I'd never seen anyone like him before. And so I couldn't stop staring, and I was still the height where my mom could physically turn my head. So she saw me staring and she just would turn my head like this over and over and over again. But I couldn't stop staring at this man. He was so unusual, and I could tell he was very uncomfortable to be there. So as I got to the end of the line with my piles and piles of food, I saw him start down the line, and he just got one bowl and one spoon. And then as I was over getting my sweet tea, because this is the South we're talking about, I saw that he was then paying for his one bowl, which he had filled up with beans and cornbread. And he had dumped a cup full of coins out, and he was pushing one coin at a time across to the woman who was taking his money. So then he came over and he sat down next to us, and I was so glad because I really wanted to see him as long as I could, just this creature who seemed like he had emerged from this other place. And he started eating really, really, really fast. And then it happened. I can't even hardly describe this moment to you all, but I will try. There was a belch that emerged from his body that was so loud and so sonorous that it literally rattled the silverware on people's trays. And then everyone stopped talking. It was like one of those E.F. Hutton moments in the commercials. And my mom was actually getting ready to take a bite, and she stopped in the middle, and it was like time froze, y'all, as no one knew what to do, because this was clearly something that's not supposed to happen. And then, oh so slowly, oh so painfully, everything started to return to reality as that man just kept on eating and everyone else returned to their conversation and their food. And as we started to leave, I again took one last look at him, and we went and we climbed in the folks that we went to the restaurant with. They had one of those classic station wagons where we got to ride in the way back, where we were turned around backwards. And as we were in the way back, getting ready to pull out of the parking lot, I watched him walk out of the restaurant and walk back behind the restaurant and into the woods. And I knew in that moment that what I was feeling was shame. Shame that was because I witnessed something that I was never meant to witness, but mostly because everyone else around me was ashamed too, because they didn't know where to put the feelings that they were having. I think about that man all the time when I'm here in Atlanta. The shame that I feel when I don't know what to do when I see a person who has no house. And I have no ending to this story, because this is a story that does not end. Okay. With that, we're going to talk about the stories that we tell as individuals, as organizations, as communities, and even on the broader scope. Because they say a lot about who we are, and they inform the choices that we make. So as I mentioned, we've talked a lot about our personal stories. And we mentioned this in the first day, but we're going to kind of go back to this idea that people tend to tell their stories as my life is going from bad to good, or my life is going from good to bad. And this comes from this article that the TED organization came out with. Now, Ennis shared with you all through her communication a whole bunch of resources that I had collected for you. Did y'all receive that? Because I want to make sure that you're getting all of these resources.
So, Shannon, if you could go to our website real quick, I can show, because it's a link that's been in the emails,
Yes.
but I can show you where there's a link directly to it. So if you go to socialimpactstudios.com, and you click on the main weekly communication support for challenging times thing at the top, this is what's the story. And in here, if you scroll down to the bottom, actually, are all of the resources that we've ever shared in our communication supports. So down at the last bullet point is the special series resources.
Awesome.
And if you wouldn't mind, because I can't
see,
seem to chat right now for some reason. If you wouldn't mind just copying that direct link and putting it in the chat.
You got it.
That would be helpful.
So this is a special page that I built for you all on my website. That's a private page that's just for this workshop series. And this has all of the resources that relate to our topics.
So we're not seeing your screen anymore.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just want to make sure I got that into, I wasn't sure if I could do that in chat at the same time. Okay. So back to our regularly scheduled programming. So once we have sort of wrapped our minds around this notion that the stories we tell ourselves start to impact the choices that we make, then we can start to tell ourselves different stories if we feel that those stories are sending us in a direction we don't want.
How you feeling?
Good. So we talked a little bit about vulnerability in a previous workshop, and I just, again, want to hit home how crucial that is to our storytelling. And that sort of links to organizational storytelling as well, which other people would call transparency at that level. So this is a really fun idea, which is that narratives tend to fall into 7 models. Overcoming the monster, rags to riches, the quest, voyage and return, comedy, tragedy, and rebirth. And this is another really great book that talks about this. I think this is a great way to think about how you shape a story and what kind of story you're telling. I'm not sure that I agree that all stories fall into this, but in terms of like how you're shaping your story, if you're looking for a starting place, then thinking about these overall shapes, it's a great place to start from.
Yeah, it's interesting that the rebirth is like such a big
with that
concept.
notion of organizational stories, even in that idea of stories tend to go from good to bad or from bad to good, how many of you have been associated with organizations either currently or in the past where if you think about it, you're like, oh yeah, that organization totally tells itself a story that has to do with one trajectory or another?
Uh-oh. Can you all hear me? Yeah. But Shannon, is she frozen on your machine too? Okay. Let's just give it a second. Uh-oh. It's just us chickens. I was saying before that concept of rebirth, that's like a big, huge concept, but I do find that there's an equivalent, which is kind of the aha moment story. I find a lot of stories that are interesting have to do with somebody like having a realization, not like a whole transformation, but just like, oh, and then I learned blah, blah, blah. It's almost like the moral to the story kind of idea that every, not just a punchline, but that there's something. Yeah, Chris.
Like her sticky story. Or with like her sticky story, like Shannon's sticky story.
Yes.
And with her understanding about how to get unstuck.
Right. And that aha was like as simple as like, oh, I just need to turn my foot in a different direction. Hi, Shannon. We were telling stories.
That's great. I appreciate that. And did you come up with some awesome epiphanies?
Well, it was about that. It was about the idea that the rebirth, like a catch-all instead of rebirth, is an aha moment. Like that one, I do think is like often a full transformation doesn't have to happen, but the best stories that I remember and seem to tell over and over again are aha moment stories.
Yeah. You just like figured something amazing out. Yeah. So I was in the middle of asking if you have in organizational dynamics started to understand that this organization has a story that it's stuck in. Like, either the story of the organization is this founder is the only way that we're going to be able to connect with the community, or that time that we almost died and we came back is like the best time of the organization and we've never been quite as juicy. Like, tell me about your experience with organizational stories.
I resonate with both of those examples because I am a founder and I'm very cautious about like my perspective is so long, that I keep telling that I keep thinking of stories, not even telling them, but I keep thinking of stories from like 20 years ago or 25 years ago. And I think, and I'm just answering until somebody else jumps in. I think the idea of like a hardship, I think those of us that are in advocacy of any kind, that's like our constant like mode of operation. So we keep telling these stories of like problem solution, instead of some other kind of visionary story.
Yeah. I'll tell one on Brandy's husband, Carlton, who was my boss at Roots, actually. And one of the things that had been very frustrating to me about the nonprofit model of organizational stories was we always have to beg for the worst. We have to put up with terrible equipment. We have to be thankful for the crappy fax machine that somebody, donates for us. And when Carlton came into leadership as the executive director at Roots, he was like, you know what? I don't think we have to do things this way. I think we can invest in better infrastructure and we will just rise to this level of work. And so he bought us all brand new computers. He paid us all a better wage. And he said, I expect you to work to this level, but we're not going to, be at that, nonprofit mentality.
Oh, no. Okay. Anybody else want to jump in with their organizational story? Oh, there you are.
I'm sorry, guys. This does not happen to me the whole rest of the week. I don't know why it's happening.
Well, you're in a space where we can fill the gaps, so don't worry about it.
Yeah. So anyway, I just really appreciated that, Carlton was willing to tell a better story for organizational leadership, and one that, wound up, causing a rising tide lifts all boats sort of mentality for us. So one of my real core tenets with the work that I do is the idea that you have to build an organizational culture for storytelling. And that is not easy. I mean, we are all busy. We have like the work of the organization to do, whatever that is. But I believe that if you take the time to tell a story in many different capacities, then you're going to get further faster. It's slow technology, but it actually is more efficacious. So I believe in the first workshop, I told you guys about.
Oh, here we go again.
I took them out because I was hoping that that might make things a little less unstable. Is that better or worse?
We can hear you now.
There was the woman who was struggling with her job, and I took the time in our review session to tell a story. There are many times in my leadership as, managing director of a dance company and other capacities where we would use story as reflection, as even, staff evaluation. We would use story as an opportunity after an event to just use that as the model. So I think I want to really encourage folks to think about how story can become a part of the work that you do in an entirely different way. So these are some of the, and hiring. I would always, when I was onboarding people, ask them to tell a story about a time when they had succeeded, but especially when they had failed and what they learned from it. Honestly, if a person couldn't tell that story, then they were typically not a person I wanted to work with. Because that told me a lot about who they were. And this was the slide that I couldn't come up with last week, so I wanted to come back to it, that our stories should always have a moment of change, and ultimately, we're trying to model through our storytelling the change we want to see in the world. So that's why it's so crucial that we find change in our story. So moving up from there, we have community stories. And this is where things I think get really juicy. Who's heard of framing theory, which I think a lot of people know about from this very short book by George Lakoff called Don't Think of an Elephant? Does anybody know enough about it to describe it to us?
No.
No? Okay. So framing theory is the idea that you can distill a whole lot of like information and ideas into very small sentences and even stories. And one of the ways that the whole political landscape has shifted over the last 30 years is because one side has done a very good job of capturing the, a wealth of information in the way it talks. And the other side has kept things super complicated. And we understand the reasons for the complexity as there's the notion of the big tent. But the way this looks on a basic level is like the right, if they were talking about the same thing, they might say, my family, my community. Whereas on the left, they would talk about our families, our community. That's just like one example of like how framing theory works and like how different that plays out in our decision making. So one of the best examples of this I saw play out was, do you remember they used to do this segment on NPR that was called This I Believe? and they would ask like an important person to come and do a short essay where they would just talk about like their fundamental beliefs and what their driving forces in the world. And one time they had this person, I believe it was somebody who was really important in the Bush administration, Bush 2. And he started this, I believe, essay by saying, "We live in a dangerous world." And if that is like the fundamental beginning of your essay for like what you're leading from, then everything flows from that. So this is like where your story comes from, right? Everything that gets framed around it. Now, I started the story that I told this morning about people who are unhoused because I wanted to talk about this notion that some things feel like they're intractable. And I feel like sometimes even when we're working on these issues, we work on them, but we're not sure that we feel like we can really do anything about them. How many of you feel like some of these things are actually intractable? Like we're going to work on them, but like we can't move the needle on them ultimately?
Sometimes.
Yeah. It's hard, right?
Yeah, sometimes.
Yeah. I'd love to hear from others. Anybody else want to speak to this?
I'll talk about it. I worked at an organization that it was a group home for teenagers. So there was a lot of, I mean, just heartbreaking stories. And a lot of the kids were, they were thrown out of their homes for like reasons, drugs, what have you. And a lot of kids had, they came out to their parents that they were gay, and they were, so it was just heartbreaking. So, I mean, a lot of that just really hit home when you said homelessness.
Mm-hmm.
That's like the first thing I thought about,
Yeah.
especially kids, and now with COVID, it's even worse.
Yeah. It can be very defeating. And I do a lot of work around this particular issue as well. And I will never forget when I was talking with some folks who do work around that, we were talking about how in other cities, they're actually buying apartments and just like putting people straight into them, and how it's just transforming the landscape. And this woman was like, "But we could never do that here." And I was like, "Really? You just gonna like put the nail in the coffin on that?" I mean, because there's like all this research about the outcomes in terms of people's health and mental health. All you have to do is just get them an apartment and help them get into it, and like thousands and millions of dollars over time are changed, saved if you do that. But she had just decided that that was impossible. So I just want to encourage us that as hard and as discouraging as it can feel, especially during these times, that if we keep putting our North Star on what is possible, then just like with our personal stories, we can start to manifest. Because remember, in the 60s, they said, by the end of this decade, we will put someone on the moon. And so they lined up all of their resources, all of the scientists, everybody got behind that dream, and they made it happen. If we did that, we could continue to move forward on so many things, which I know is very hard to imagine right now in this current moment, but it is possible. So I want to take a moment, especially around this idea of community stories, to talk about a few projects that I've done. So one was with Georgia Council on Developmental Disabilities, where I was helping to raise awareness about people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And it was especially important because they wanted to functionalize people's awareness around this Medicaid waiver, which is like the key that unlocks helping people live independent lives. And there's 6,000 people on the waiting list here in Georgia.
and all we have to do is fund it. But that seems like anything else, like climate change and the unhoused and, you know, so many things, right? But we went about systematically telling all of these stories, and they would hand walk the stories right into the legislators' offices. So there were some downfalls to that project, including the fact that they had not brought artists into the design phase of that project. And so I was constantly sort of butting my head up against the box that they built without me in mind. But after I went through a year of the project, I came back to them and said, look, I feel like this, that, and the other thing could change. And they listened. So we wound up making a podcast and turning it into an interactive map of the state of Georgia. And now we're talking about this other iteration that's going to like tour the whole state of Georgia with drive-in theater performances in 6 different cities across the state. So that's like a real change in terms of like when artists can be involved in the design and storytelling. So I also did a project. I've done a couple projects now that had to do with working with the unhoused, and that raised awareness and dollars and helped people just tell their own stories. And I think this notion of like who gets to tell their story, I mean, we talked about that from the first episode of our little 3-episode podcast here with Social Impact Studios and StoryMuse, right? Like we're taking back from Netflix and Disney Plus and all of the rest of it. Like we are telling our own stories through this process. So on a more like global human level, I just want to tap back into some amazing resources that have been with us, and some of these folks have passed on. But Joseph Campbell did a lot of really deep story work. He traveled the globe and looked at myth and mythos in all these different cultures, and he came up with some really great, important writing that had to do with how our stories connect us. And you can now watch some of the best summaries of his work on Netflix, I discovered, if you don't have time to read all of his seminal texts. But the key thing that has to do with Joseph Campbell was the hero's journey, or the shero's journey. So he mapped out the idea that heroes, and I think his seminal talk with Bill Moyers uses Star Wars as the example. So he talks about how Luke Skywalker has the call to adventure, and he wants to ignore the call. And you can map this to the Wizard of Oz, to Dorothy. There's all these different, you know, awesome heroes that go through this. You know, there's the call to adventure, ignoring the call. There's the wise person or the sage. You know, and it's really interesting when you start geeking out on this stuff to watch how it plays out over and over again in terms of these sort of more global stories that we follow. And one of the things that I started paying attention to, though, is like we used to have these like white hat heroes in, you know, mid-century. And then in our pop culture, we've started having anti-heroes. Like we're really starting to celebrate people that are dark and twisted, but we can't help but loving them because we understand their complicated nature. And I really see that as us sort of seeing, in terms of the US versus the rest of the world, this is playing out our complicated nature with the rest of the world through these individual stories. We are no longer that white hat, nor were we back then either. That was just a story that we were telling ourselves. But this is just how this plays out, you know, story by story. I will say one of the best things about pop culture these days is that it is getting not just complicated in terms of anti-heroes, but we're telling ourselves a lot different stories as well. One of the things that's interesting to me, though, is that we literally don't even see the same stories when it comes to history. So there was this recent revelation that came out that the same textbook companies were sending out different textbooks to different parts of the country. And I'm not sure if this one is on our resource page, so I will drop this in, but this is a story about how like there were different segments of American history that were being sent to California and Texas, I think were the primary things. So this is just like something to really pay attention to in terms of how story is powerful, and that power can really be abused. This is another example. So our universal quest for truth and belief in mystery has been sacrificed to fake news and alternative facts. So coming back to that notion of manifesting stories, I was going to, at this time, have us write a manifesting story for ourselves. And we got a little bit of a late start, and my internet woes have not helped at all, but I want to challenge you all to write a manifesting story for yourself. And I think, you know, we could do that together, or you could take the time to do that after this is over. Actually, let me take a moment to play this for you, because I think this is one of the best examples of a manifesting story I've ever seen.
One thing among many that COVID has taught us is how we may need to recalibrate our expectations and our imaginations. Tonight, author Kelly Corrigan shares her humble opinion and projects what it will be like when a corner is turned.
Sometimes when I feel outmatched by the thing in front of me, I do a mental exercise. I tell myself the story of what happened as if it's over and I nailed it. This morning, I waited for 54 minutes to check out from the Safeway. The woman in front of me, whose hair and makeup was perfect, had 7 bottles of Martini and Rossi vermouth. That's it. And the guy in front of her had a full face, double ventilator gas mask. And I felt outmatched by the thing in front of me. So right there, I told myself the story of the pandemic of 2020 and how we nailed it. My success fantasy went like this. At first, it was awful. Nothing but bad news on top of bad news. But then we rose up. We made soups and stews for old people and dropped them off so they felt included and secure and nourished. We read books to children over the internet. We stepped outside at the end of the day and played music and clapped so that each of us knew we were not alone. We sent pizzas and Chinese food to ERs to sustain both our hospitals and our restaurants. We called old friends and told them things we'd forgotten to say. I miss you. I still think of you. Remember that time? We turned up, all of us, on our screens to keep businesses afloat. And in so doing, we're exposed to the more tender elements of our colleagues' lives. Pets and children were now, to our mutual benefit, in the frame. People figured out they didn't need fancy equipment to exercise. We stopped flying around and jumping in cars for no reason. Everyone planted things they could eat. We played cards with our families. We had long conversations. We identified what kind of learning can be delivered online. We discovered that teaching is the most complex, high-impact profession known to man, and we started compensating our teachers fairly for their irreplaceable work. Everyone voted after coronavirus. Kids who lived through the virus valued science above all. They became researchers and doctors, kicking off the greatest period of world-positive discovery and innovation the planet has ever seen. We came, finally and forever, to appreciate the profound fact of our shared humanity and relish the full force of our love for one another.
Thank you, Kelly Corrigan, and wouldn't it be wonderful?
So before you write your manifesting story, I used to just have people just full on just write the best story about the possible future that they would like to create. However, I recently heard this wonderful episode of The Hidden Brain, and they were talking about the fact that it's a little naive to just write it without planning for some of the things that you might do that can get in your way. So I will also drop this into the chat, and also, and I think I might have already added this to our resources, but my chat, and so the idea is that when you write your manifesting story, that you also take a moment to write into that the places where you might be an obstacle, like how might you get in your own way, but then ultimately that you write your plan. And with that, I just want to say again, thank you so much for the opportunity to have been with you all for these last 3 sessions. It's been tremendous, and I want to open it up to the group and even see if we want to take a few minutes to work on our stories.
So I had a question about manifesting stories. Remembering, like, if I think of them as stories and I think of beginning, you know, like your advice was make sure you know your opening line and you know your ending line.
Yeah.
That's really interesting and really hard sometimes. Like I find that my manifesting story is just kind of like, and then it's just gonna be great. You know, like actually being bold enough to like speak a vision of the ending thing. Our culture doesn't support that, you know, very well. Even Chris, like writing in the Disney ending idea, like there's a lot of times when we stop ourselves from like actually saying that ending.
Yeah, it's true. I think one thing that is helpful is to put a time on it. So I recently made a manifesting story for myself in another workshop, and just like full transparency, one of my core things is around my relationship to food. So I thought it would be helpful to like write a manifesting story where I have a full and healthy relationship to food. And so I made it, I made the manifesting story happen on February 14th, you know, as my self-love day. And so I just started it almost as if it were like a journal entry. You know, it's February 14th, and you know, this is what today is like. So it could be as simple as that. Yeah, I think how it ends is interesting, because you know your life won't be over on the day that that's manifested, and so I think it just comes down to what is the theme.
Yeah, and also I think it's different if I'm telling that story from an organizational leadership perspective than my own personal, you know, experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, and by the way, I didn't just put Dr. King's picture up here again because I had it with this alternative facts picture. I had it because I wanted to remind folks of his I Have a Dream speech. That's also one of the best manifesting stories I've ever seen, you know?
Yeah, it's so good to think of these, like the continuum of this workshop, these 3 ways of like getting to this point. I think, I know personally, I don't know if other people do this, but I separate the idea of storytelling as a very like intimate and personal and vulnerable thing, and like almost at an organizational level or a social level, it is like not as genuine or something. and because it's constructed, or it's, you know, I don't know, but it's really like, it's freeing to think of it all the same way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It helps when we can be more transparent, for sure.
So what kinds of ways do people see like working this in, like after you've like been thinking and hearing about this for 3 weeks with Shannon, like what are people going to do differently, or do you see a new application, or even what is getting in your way that we have the benefit of Shannon's advice here to really unpack or to remove a barrier?
I think I'm always telling story in my head. I never thought it was part of a dream or advancement of anything, but I suppose that's what it is. So I can look at them in a different ways. However, passing from telling myself stories, and which is acknowledging the way I see some of the facts, some of the steps, let's say on the journey of a project, and make them public is a totally different work. Whether it's through words or through visuals or through diagrams or things like that, it's a huge work to make them meaningful for others.
Yeah. What do you think about that, Shannon? I really appreciate that, Gillian, because that's kind of what I was also like, I wasn't sure what I was feeling, but it was the making it meaningful for others. Mm. And how much of the energy goes into that versus the authenticity of the story, you know, like, because you are encouraging us to plan and to have a flow, you know, for stories, not to just be like, say whatever we want or just tell a rambling story. So there's some impact. But I struggle with that too. Like, at what point is it crossing over and becoming something that's more about like me trying to figure out what's meaningful for others?
Well, I feel like it's helpful to have, I think of it as a story bank. So like, what are your go-to stories, as long as you kind of keep refreshing the bank. And I feel like, Gillian, y'all are really good at that in terms of like telling the stories of the impact of your organization. And I want to be clear that even though I'm an oral storyteller, there are obviously many ways to tell a story, that you can incorporate visuals in lots of different ways. I think I like to say, start with the spoken story and then see what it leads to. But I don't think that there's any real wrong way to do this.
I guess my question is also how necessary it is.
I think that it's really helpful to connect with your community and to communicate the work that you're doing by telling the stories of who you're impacting and the people that are in the organization, as it just helps other people understand the work. And that's just my experience of what storytelling does for us. I think of my experience of other organizations or brands even, where the difference between, just like something splashy and designed versus a story that brings me in, and I feel like 9 times out of 10, that's what's going to do it for me. Mm-hmm.
I think there's another space, which is kind of a Venn diagram of those two universes. Mm-hmm. For me personally, that I'm relating to, that Gillian is talking about, which is the practice of designed experience. Mm-hmm. That that is about engagement. And I think, Gilin, I think once we're in those worlds, like that's the work that we do, we can't unsee that. We can't unknow that we're also designing and we're trying to like create an experience, and we're trying to organize people towards some communal experience. I can't unsee that. So I have to be really intentional about kind of saying, okay, I'm gonna let go of my design controls, and I'm going to like tap into a personal story. That might be different than an artistic expression that is also a representation of a personal story. It's like the Platonic concept, you know, of like, there's an idea of a chair, and then there's a chair, and then there's, you know, that the idea is only like the only pure form of that, and we can never actually get there. So rather than worrying too much about it, I just think of like, okay, well, how is that energy being carried? How is the intention of that energy being carried through that? And I found, Shannon, when you did the exercise of us not like responding, not having to have validation back, I find that my very best work comes when I can just be in the zone of the work or the story and not even be thinking about like my need for whatever my own ego thing is. Like, do I need validation, or do I need people to feel good, or whatever the thing is, or do I need them to like stand up and cheer and rally and let's go get them? All of that is me needing some kind of like response. And I really took from that exercise, Shannon, like if you just get rid of that idea of response, what else could fill that space? And it could be meaningful exchange, or it could, because when Chris, you were talking about when you weren't responding emotionally, you got disconnected from it. So that's not the goal, but I found that really helpful.
Nice. Hey, we have a comment here in the chat from Catherine. I'd love to hear more about this, Catherine, if you'd like to talk this out in terms of your storytelling needs.
Well, I guess I work at the Myrna Loy in Helena, Montana, and it's a converted jailhouse. It's the old county jailhouse, and our story is just beginning. So the snow will be flying here pretty soon, and we need a new furnace. So it's a huge building. It's super cold. It's an old granite jailhouse. So we're trying to fund our furnace. So I think we're gonna ask our community to help us fund the furnace. So I think there's different pieces, you know, of this story. So I think, how are we gonna fund the furnace? How are we gonna use the money? How are we gonna ask people to, you know, dig deep into their pocketbooks? So I think it's just the beginning. So I don't know what you think would be a good start.
I love the idea of you saying our story is just beginning and snow is starting to fly and we need to fund this. Like that is such a clear story that like has lots of room to grow. I feel like if I saw that on a fundraising appeal or, you know, like a visual story, like that would grab my attention, you know, and you could say like, we have so many stories that we want to tell, and like even have it go to a blank screen and have it be like, and we can't tell them unless we have heat, you know. Like
us in our parkas and
yeah,
enjoy a film.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree, because this is, Catherine, this is one of those, if you remember back to our action plan clarity, like this is one of those immediate needs stories that gets people like visceral. It's very visceral. So it would be really easy to be like, wow, you know, we need a new furnace, like save our furnace or whatever. But the idea, the way that Shannon's talking about using storytelling, like leveraging and really elevating storytelling with what naturally came out of you as a way to like transition us into that like feeling. That's like the best of both worlds.
Thank you.
Yeah. Great. Wow. Well, we've been on a journey with you, Shannon. We have learned so much. I really appreciate it. I think I'd love to do more of this. I know that you're on our weekly calls, so we can always like tap into the wealth of knowledge. And I know I'm thinking differently about storytelling than I had before. So I think, are there any parting like words that you want to say, Shannon, to bolster us in our storytelling?
Well, in the words of my colleagues at the Moth, I hope you have a story-worthy week. Nice, story-worthy week. Great. Well, thanks everybody for showing up and being part of all of this. And thanks for the people who threw some money into the hat. It was greatly appreciated. And Shannon and I, we need to talk about kind of like post it, where all this is gonna live, and so you can tap back into it to make that a real like resource for you. And we'll continue to do that.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. See you soon.
Take care.
Bye. Bye. Bye, Chris. Hi, bye.